this.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for having me. And I think it's a great moment to have an event about Rose Schneiderman for all the things that are going on. Labor activity, the right to vote. She was involved in all that, the right to speech. um, so what I want to do is actually start out by sharing. I've been thinking about her for many years. I knew her as an older lady, but I didn't know much about her until she died. Um, and I remember her voice, and then I had a little tape, part of a tape that she used audio to tape her book, and somebody transcribed it. She wrote a memoir. And so this not only shows her voice as a older woman, but it shows part of her personality. Um, so I'm going to play it for you. I'll play part of it for you. Okay. Tell me if you can hear it.
But I was told of stories of what happened, terrible things that happened to other little girls who told tales. Never, never must one repeat.
We lost it a
Can you
little
hear
bit.
it?
No, we just lost it a little bit, Annie.
Yeah. Mm. Well, you can't really hear it very well.
We
Yeah.
don't
Okay. That's
understand.
okay.
Sorry about
I'm going to turn it off.
What is said
Can you hear it now?
Yes.
in one's home or anywhere else, for that matter, if it concerns other people. I never forgot that lesson, and as a result, I'm glad to say that gossip thing is out of my line entirely. I can keep secrets, and I never tell one friend what the other friend thinks about her or him. When I was 6, I entered a Russian primary school. Was in the neighborhood, and I just walked there. I don't know that I learned very much. I was only there one term, I believe, when my father left his job unbeknown to my mother and went to Helm, which was a big city not far from where we lived, but it belonged to a different province. It seems there was a contractor there who undertook to make uniforms for the army.
Okay, I'm going to turn it off. Okay, I'm going to get rid of my cat. Hang on a second. Sorry about that. My apologies. Okay. I was going to get rid of her earlier, but so I'm going to let's see. start by beginning at the beginning of her life. And the Schneidermans, these Schneidermans came over in 1890 from Helm. They left secretly. Jews at the time didn't have passports, couldn't get passports. Her father left ahead of them. And supposedly, she says that he left secretly and didn't tell her mother, but she's not sure. Maybe the mother knew. But the kids didn't know because they didn't want to have them know anything that would be disclosed to anybody. And they lived in this kind of area, came over on a boat, originally in the bottom of the boat, sleeping with everybody. And her little brother, who was my grandfather, got sick, and they put them in a fancy room. So they had the ability to come over that way. And this is, of course, where they lived in the Lower East Side. And when they moved here, they were very poor. The father had been here first, sent money over, and but a couple years later, he died of meningitis, and he had to be buried with a Jewish society that paid for poor Jews to be buried. And the mother was left destitute, just about to have a baby. They ended up she put both sons into an orphanage. Was supposed to be for a couple years, but they stayed for 10 years because she wanted them to be educated. And Rose stayed home and took care of the baby, and she worked in a fur factory that ended up, not a fur factory, but a factory that made not shawls, like ponchos. Can't think of the name. Then she lost her job because they went out of style, and Rose ended up working at the age of 13, and worked in department stores because the orphanage she had been in helped find jobs for Jewish girls so that they would not work in the factory. And her mother didn't want her to work in the factory. But finally, I think she realized that she was not making very much money. And a friend of hers taught her how to do cap linings. So she got a job in a cap factory. And you can see in this picture, which is online, you might have seen this picture, all the sort of material and fabric. You can tell how difficult the situation was. But in the beginning, she was not interested in unions. In fact, she supported what she called the scabs. She supported the folks coming in to against the strikes. And women were not organized. Women were not organized in the cap factories, in many, many kinds of industries. And the garment, the shirtwaist workers, these are the shirtwaists that everybody wore. And so she and her mother actually and sister went to Montreal with relatives, stayed with relatives thinking they could get better work. She ended up working in a cap factory. And this is where she learned about unions, not from the factory actually, but from some local friends that she met. They taught her about socialism and unions. And so when she came back to the United States, she went back to a cap factory, and she and another young woman started the first women's local. And they went to the United Jewish Cap Makers, and they said, you don't have enough people signed up. So they went back and got more people signed up. And she became part of their board and was really one of the early or first women on a board, a labor board. And she began organizing for the cap makers, was taken to New Jersey by the head of the cap makers, and she'd never really spoken to a large crowd, was shaking in her boots, but that's where she sort of started speaking to large crowds. And she helped organize the cap makers strike in 1904. And I'm showing you some pictures of some of the other women who were active in the labor movement at that time. This is Pauline Newman, another Jewish labor activist. And there were other people, Leonora O'Reilly, Irish labor activist, and Clara Lemlich, who you'll see in a minute. And what happened in 1904 is that the Women's Trade Union League, a group of wealthy and some not so wealthy women who had started the Women's Trade Union League in America. It originally started in England to promote labor, women joining labor unions, getting their rights, because the labor organizations were male and they were not interested in organizing women. So she joined the Women's Trade Union League and became their Lower East Side organizer. She spoke Yiddish. Her English was quite good. She was a great student. She wanted to be a teacher originally, but decided to sort of get educated through the union. Someone offered to pay her to go to school, but she ended up using that pay to have a salary at the Women's Trade Union League. So she was organizing all kinds of types of factories, not just garment factories, but box makers and various other types of endeavors. And then, a lot of these factories were having the organizing was happening by factory, and the fights and the walkouts were happening individual factories. And so by 1909, she was already highly involved. The Triangle factory and some other 2 or 3 other factories, there were walkouts there, but nothing was really happening. And the factory owners had their own organization that they started to develop around that time, which fought as a unit, their own little unit. The International Ladies Garment Workers that Rose was involved in, as well as the Women's Trade Union League, had meetings to organize the women, and thousands showed up, not only at Cooper Union, but they also showed up at other places. And Clara Lemlich eventually got on stage because nothing was really happening, and a lot of people wanted to have a strike, a general strike, not just individual strikes. They wanted to have a general strike. And she got on stage and asked, Rose raised her hand for the prayer, the Jewish prayer, so that she was sort of one of the fires that started this going. And Rose, meanwhile, was speaking at another place where there were other people, because there was an overflow of people at this meeting. So here you can see the meeting, lots of people, and the women and men raising their hands. But there weren't just Jews, there were Italians, there were native-born women. And this is the Women's Trade Union League. They're organizing. They were out on the street. People were getting arrested. There were goons, as they call them, that the factory owners hired to disrupt the fight, but they went on for 14 weeks. And this was prior to the Triangle Fire. And they finally got a commitment from many of the factories. just trying to see here. Except for the Triangle and some other, a handful of other factories. And they didn't get everything they wanted, but they got a number of things, including no longer having to pay for thread and sewing machines, which I left out earlier. Rose had bought her own sewing machine originally and had lost it in a fire. And so she realized that from now on, she would rent her sewing machine. But in this case, finally, they were supposed to provide sewing machines. There was an equal division of work, the ability for the union to negotiate collective bargaining, early collective bargaining for their wages, at least four holidays per year and other things. And here are some of the Jewish people on strike. Okay, let's see what we got here. This was quite an event. There hadn't been a strike like this, men or women, across the country. 20,000, it's called the uprising of the 20,000, but there were, some say 30 to 40,000. And wealthy women joined. Rose actually was one of the people who went around recruiting college students. She went to Smith, she went to Vassar, she went to Columbia. She spoke to students, and students came out, and wealthy women were a part of this, had also been a part of the suffrage. So they were all connected, and some not connected. But this was sort of the first strike like this, where other people were coming out and supporting the strikers, not just financially, but walking, on the street. So less than a year later, there was a fire in Newark where they lost 25 people, mostly young women. And the chief of the fire department in New York actually said, this is going to happen in New York. And it in fact did. I think it was about a year later, literally. And he said, we've got to do something. And this is the chief of the fire department who actually was there on site at the Triangle Fire, which on March 25th caught on fire. The higher floors couldn't be reached, and that was where the workers were. People were jumping out. I know, some of you know this story. The fire department did the best they could. Their ladders went up, but not as far as they needed to. People burned out from suffocation inside, coming out on some of the fire escapes that melted or broke. The doors were locked. They locked some doors in factories to keep out union organizers, to keep people from stealing. And there's some debate as to whether it was locked, but it sounds like they were locked. And some came down through elevators. The elevator finally collapsed. There were people, great heroes inside, who helped people get out. It was just horrific. And people from the community came, including Frances Perkins, and this helped inspire her, the head of the Department of Labor later on, to get more involved with factories and unions. And at the time, I'm sure there were a lot of different quotes as to how many people died. Girls leaped to their death. And just days later, there was a memorial march. About 150,000 marched, and 400,000 total people were on the street corners. There were labor people. There were, religious people, politicians. Everybody was out. It was a protest and a memorial. And they did not actually know of 6. They eventually learned of 6 more in the most recent the names of some of the people who had died. They didn't know. United Hebrew Trades. So after the fire, the Red Cross, Rose and other people went out leading people, the Red Cross and others, to people's houses so they could find the families of these people. And there was a major amount. What made this significant is there were so many young people who died, young women and some young men. But this shows you what the mass of people marching was. And then on April 2nd or 3rd, can't remember, there was a meeting at the Metropolitan Opera House, one of a number of them over time, that a memorial meeting. But people were there speaking. Rabbi Weiss, who was a very important activist at the time, Frances Perkins was on the stage, but she didn't speak. Eventually, after a lot of yelling and screaming and people upset, and there was a lot of rumble in the auditorium, Rose got on and in a very soft voice, not a loud voice, made a very impactful speech. And I can, if you're interested, I can read some of it to you. Okay. Okay. I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. We have tried you, good people of the public, and we have found you wanting. The old Inquisition had its rack and its thumbscrews and its instruments of torture with iron teeth. We know what these things are today. The iron teeth are our necessities. The thumbscrews are the high-powered and swift machinery close to which we must work. And the rack is here in the fire trap structure that will destroy us the minute they catch fire. This is not the first time girls have been burned alive in the city. Every week I must learn of the untimely death of my sister workers. Every year, thousands of us are maimed. The life of men and women is so cheap and the property is so sacred. There are so many of us. For one job, it matters little if 146 of us are burned to death. We have tried you, good citizens, and we are trying you now, and you have a couple of dollars for the sorrowing mothers, brothers, and sisters by way of a charity gift. But every time the workers come out in the only way they know how, against conditions which are unbearable, the strong hand of the law is allowed to press down heavily upon us. I can't talk fellowship to you who are gathered here. Too much blood has been spilled. I know from my experience it's up to the working people to save themselves. The only way they can save themselves is by a strong working class movement. She rarely wrote her speeches out. They were okay, wait a minute. Okay. They were impromptu. So that was only part of the speech. But what happened was this meeting, the speech, Frances Perkins being there, who was already involved in the government. What happened was the government, the New York State government, stepped in, and to support this, there was a factory investigating commission. Pull this up. That was developed, and they came up with regulations and were a model for states all over the place, and were a big model. This is just a picture I love of her, a photograph taken by a very good photographer in the 1912. So this is about the Factory Investigating Commission. They had women and men fill out forms all over the state of writing about what the conditions were like in the factories, and they investigated Governor Smith went on investigations to find out how the factories were, and they created laws. So after the fire and before the fire, Rose was also involved in the suffrage movement from about 1905, 1906. She and some of the other working class women were involved in the suffrage movement, but more recently have gotten more credit. And Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was the granddaughter of, now I can't think, the daughter of Carrie, Susan B. Anthony, Carrie.
No, Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Yes, yes. And she was sort of the initiator of bringing the larger women's suffrage movement to recognizing that working women should be a part of this. That in fact, if they left them out of the major movement, they would not get the vote. And she was friendly with Rose. She had joined the Women's Trade Union League. She started a small suffrage organization that Rose and Leonora Riley and some of these other women were a part of. They went and they spoke in different parts of New York. I love this. Are politics dirty? Then call in the cleaning women. They spoke, she spoke on at different places in the city. And I'm just showing you a picture of her mother and sister to show some personal sides. Rose was, loved her family, was very involved in the family, but very, very involved in the labor movement.
Thank you for another quick tutorial. The camera is not.
Okay. And so she kept her lives separate. This is Harriet Stanton Blatch and Rose speaking. So Rose and some of these other working women actually split off from Harriet and their group to establish a smaller group that didn't last very long. And they all ended up in the New York suffrage movement later on. But she spoke all over the place, and then went, I'm going to backtrack here, and went to Ohio, was called out to Ohio and Wisconsin to speak at their suffrage events before a suffrage vote. And this is where, I don't know, the phrase bread for all and roses too, which originally was not something she created and wasn't from Lawrence Mills, but came from California with suffrage and Women's Trade Union League women out in California way earlier. And then Rose, she embellished on it, and which is something she was very good at. And this became a famous thing. What the women who labors wants is the right to live, not simply exist, the right to life and the sun and music and art. You have nothing that the humblest worker has not a right to have also. The worker must have bread, but she must have roses too. Help, you women of privilege, give her the ballot to fight with. So she spoke in parks, she spoke in auditoriums in Ohio, and she spoke to small groups of women, which is what that came from. So here you have a flyer of her coming. So in 1912, she met another suffragist who was not part of the Women's Trade Union League, from an Irish immigrant, Maud Schwartz. And she invited her, she was speaking Italian at a suffrage rally, lots of Italian workers. So she and Rose ended up basically running the Women's Trade Union League for many years, and they were considered intimate partners. There, you know, we don't know ultimately whether they were or not, but there was a lot that says that. They were kept very secret. Their friends knew. They traveled together, they shared gifts together, they spent time on vacations together. But one of the important things is that both Rose and Maud were very secretive. A lot of people were about their lives. And Maud came from a situation where her family, I have met on Zoom and on the phone, her relatives, that she would have been she would have been excommunicated from the church as well as her own family if she had shared some of her private life. And she, her name was Maud Schwartz. She took the name of a man earlier on who she had been living with, but hid that. So she never got married, but took his name and became a citizen, but really wasn't a citizen. And these are things I found out later as I've done research. So, and Rose was very private. So even though they were amongst a lot of women who were same-sex partners and lived together, and some were not, they were heterosexual, there were all kinds of sort of living situations, but these two women were very private, which made sense. Here's Rose. She was known across the nation. And this is her, they're talking about her being the Napoleon of the Lower East Side. She was tiny, but she was fierce. And I kind of knew her as a very, she could be fierce as a great aunt. She was kind of scary, very cute, adorable, but a little intimidating. So again, speaking about suffrage all across the nation, delivered an address on the suffrage question, and went across the country agitating for labor, trying to get people involved in labor unions. And continuing to work on the fire and safety in the factories. So another event that happened in 1912 and then in 1914, she spoke to legislators in New York at the State House. Let me see. Were saying that women were too delicate to vote. So they did not want to vote for suffrage. And she said in 1912, the women in the laundries, for instance, stand for 13 to 14 hours in the terrible steam and heat with their hands in hot starch. Surely these women won't lose any more of their beauty and charm by putting a ballot in the box once a year. Then they are likely to lose standing in foundries or laundries. In 1914, she went down in February with some other women from New York and all over the country and led 300 to 400 women to march to President Wilson's White House. And she and 4 other women went in and sat in his office and spoke to him, trying to get him to convince him to vote for suffrage, to pursue the suffrage. In 1919, she and another woman, Mary Anderson, were chosen to go to an international women's conference right around the peace conference. And they actually were headed to the peace conference, the larger peace conference, but she couldn't make it because of her passport and the fact that she had been Russian, Polish. And they started an annual International Working Women's Conference, and this is the meeting in Washington that they held. And this is where she met Eleanor Roosevelt, who became a longtime friend. Eleanor isn't in this picture, but she was there helping translate French. There were women from all over the world, including India there. And Rose has a sort of a scattered history working with women of color. She was a part of the Negro Labor Committee. She worked with another woman, an African-American woman, to do a survey of women laundry workers. She tried to unionize workers and did get the laundry workers unionized, spent many years working on that effort. But later on, and I'll tell you in a minute, she, after World War I, and she was, against World War I, a lot of the women that she was with were, and they also were a part of an organization afterwards called the Cause and Cure of War. They didn't want war again, but as Hitler came in, they certainly did, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. But she, somebody recently shared with me a quote by her and Leonora Riley. Although they were promoting trying to get women of color into the labor unions, this was in response to wondering why more Black women weren't in the factories. And she and Leonora said, the colored girl is not acceptable for factory work. They don't know how to do it. It's too tough. That was the sort of, I'm encapsulating it. And which sounds pretty crazy, but I don't know whether she was saying this because that's what she believed the reason why they weren't hiring Black workers. This was right around the Great Migration from the South. So in 1920, a lot was going on. She became one of the founding members, or not on the founding board of the American Civil Liberties Union. She also ran for Senate, the US Senate, under the Farmer Labor Party, didn't get a lot of votes, but had a great platform, including universal health care, free speech, things like that, childcare. She and some of the other people from the from the Civil Liberties Union went up to Mount Vernon, New York. And specifically, I think they went up to see if they might get arrested. I don't know, to speak out of the corner. They read the Constitution, and they were chased around the block a number of times and put in jail and released. And I think they proved that a number of the cities and areas in New York and other places were not allowing people to just have free speech. This is her button from the Farmer Labor Party, arresting the speakers. So in 1922, she actually directly met Eleanor Roosevelt and then FDR. And Frances Perkins would say that she really was the person who, she and her friend Maud, basically got FDR to recognize more about labor. And he then sounded like a labor union organizer himself. So also in 1920, after the vote, and in New York got their vote in 1917, but after the victory in Washington, which did not really get the vote for women of color, but the victory for more white women, Rose and a lot of the what we call industrial or labor feminists came out against the other suffragists who were for the Equal Rights Amendment, wanted an Equal Rights Amendment. Rose and Frances Perkins, Eleanor Roosevelt, all these labor activists that she was working with were against the ERA, which now people are like, wow. But they were worried that the women would lose all the things that they had worked for to get to for them, which a number of the laws that they had gotten and rights they had gotten were more protective of women but also equal fighting for equal pay. They didn't get equal pay at that point. But the rights that they got and the safety regulations they wanted for everybody. So there was a big schism and never got worked out, but she really was one of the people that perhaps was involved in preventing it to be passed. She did a lot of work with domestic workers. She also tried to get them unionized and get them workman's compensation. This is Rose in Maine. In 1936, she lost, in 1937, she lost her mother and her friend Maud and was up in Maine recuperating. So then Rose in 1933, when FDR became president, one of the first agencies that he established with the support of and the drive of Francis Perkins was the National Recovery Act in 1933, and she was the only woman labor advisor on the Labor Advisory Board. And this was a precursor to the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board. And it existed to try to get more standardized safety and wage and everything. But the Supreme Court eventually deemed it unconstitutional. And then the NLRB came. So Rose, as part of that, she was there for, I guess it was about 2 or 3 years, went to Puerto Rico to organize workers and help the needle workers down there. And this is the National, the Labor Advisory Group and Francis Perkins. And this is in Puerto Rico, where she spent a lot of time. And Eleanor Roosevelt came down she said, come on down, Eleanor, and see what's going on down here. Because there were a lot of needle workers still working in their homes and not being paid very well. So after the board was dissolved, she and her friend Maud died. She became the head secretary of the Department of Labor. Her friend Maud had been the secretary of Labor in New York. And she worked there as well as the Women's Trade Union League, continued to run the Women's Trade Union League, although eventually that stopped because there really wasn't a need. And they ran out of money. Here she is on the New York State Executive Committee. And this is just an example of her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt. And this is the head of the International Ladies Garment Workers, David Dubinsky. And they're at a play, which I've never seen, maybe some of you have, called Pins and Needles, which was about the labor movement. And while FDR was in power and before they went into the war, she and a number of women from women's groups were, I'm just trying to get my information here, got together, organizations like the University Women and the National Council of Jewish Women, the Women's Trade Union League, Women's League of Voters. They were, like many other people, worried about the Jews, the refugees, and they wanted America to get into the war. And this was between 1936 and 1941. It was called the Fight for Freedom Committee. And Rose piece of paper here. Well, basically came out and said, if we cannot, she came out to the National Women's Trade Union League and others saying, we can't be isolationists. We have to enter this war. And this group of women lobbied Congress and FDR to get into the war. You know, they could be at least a part of what persuaded him a little bit. And after America was in the war, she went out with the war board and went out to support the WACs and made volunteer calls for people to buy bonds. She continued to work with the Women's Trade Union League and Frances Perkins, Rose DeSota, and some other women, part of the Women's Trade Union League. And she retired in the 50s. And this is, so recently there was a commemoration, and there's a beautiful memorial if you should go to see, that was put in, was celebrated in October. But this was the sign that was put up originally on the Triangle Fire building. And there's Rose, as I knew her, and Frances Perkins and her friend Polly Newman and fire department people, and David Dubinsky, again, International Ladies Garment Workers. This happens to be my family, part of my family, and my grandparents and Rose. Rose is on the far right with the little black dress, and I'm the little girl in the middle between the two grandparents. This again is her as a little lady, and it's hard to tell that she might have been a little intimidating. My family just really adored her. We lived in Washington. She lived in New York, and I think that, you know, sometimes people, she was not always well loved. She was loved, but not liked always. She liked to tell people what to do, but she was quite a lady. And this is my dad and Rose. And this is an obituary or that came out after she died. Somebody was called at the New York Times, and where it says, a tiny bundle, red-haired bundle of social dynamite, Rose Schneiderman did more to upgrade the dignity and living standards of working women than any other American. And in Maine, there was a mural that was made, commissioned, and was at the Labor Department. And she's depicted in here. It's a Maine mural. It's the history of Maine labor, but also the influence of the national influence of Frances Perkins and Rose Schneiderman and FDR. And that the mural was taken down by the governor at the event at the time of the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Fire, and then placed in a museum where everybody can see it now. She has notoriety now. She's still in the New York Times. And recently, in 2019, there was a women's march called Bread and Roses in honor, and they said it was in honor of Rose. And I thought I'd do my last part of singing Bread and Roses to you. As we go marching, marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill lofts gray are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses. For the people hear us singing bread and roses, bread and roses. As we go marching, marching, we battle to for men, for they are women's equals, and we march with them again. Small art and love and beauty, their drudging spirits knew. Yes, it is bread we fight for, and we fight for roses too. As we go marching, marching, unnumbered women dead go crying through our singing their ancient call for bread, small art and love and beauty, their drudging spirits knew. Yes, it is bread we fight for, and we fight for roses too. As we go marching, marching, we bring the greater day. The rising of the women mean the rising of the race. No more the drudge and idler tend that toil as one reposes, for the sharing of life's glories, bread and roses, bread and roses. Thank you.
Well, I want to tell you, Annie, that was terrific. And you bring an important part of history to us, the great, great program. And thank you very much. Anybody have any particular questions?
And I left quite a bit out, but
I have one comment to
Sure.
share with you. I was speaking to Rhonda Ginsburg this morning, and she shared with the people standing around that I think it was her aunt who was supposed to be in the Triangle factory on the day of the fire.
Oh,
But
wow.
she mentioned that it was a Saturday and that she went to her Shabbat service. And she
Right.
had compromised with the workers that she would go work 3 Saturdays of the year, of the month. And yet on one, she would attend services. So actually,
Wow.
she was
Wow.
saved. But I never knew that it was a Saturday.
And you know, it makes me think about something. So Rose's family, my family actually, who were originally Orthodox, kind of, they lost that piece, and were not, eventually attending shul. But certainly she was as Jewish as, she could be,
Well,
I have a question.
Mhm.
I know, and it's funny because it's something you don't hear a lot about, that the owners of the factory were tried and found not guilty. What did Rose think of? I mean, clearly, and then they made a lot of money off of the fire too.
Right. Oh yeah, she was fighting that. She did testify at one of the hearings. She was definitely was, thought they were guilty. Yeah.
Okay.
well, I tell you, when you get this kind of input, it's one thing to read about it or to hear about it. You brought a very personal story, which very heartfelt and very much appreciated. And
Thank you.
thank you very much for being a program for us and a very important part of history. So any other questions, comments? So Annie, thank you so much and all the best with your talks that you give
Sure. Thank you.
and sharing the story. And as we said before, it's about telling the story. And there are really some terrific and important stories. And it took a lot of courage for Rose to do what she did.
Right.
And not every day did it work out. So
Right.
it's great. So with that, thank you all for coming. It's been recorded, and we're going to have it around to share. And Annie, thank you so much for taking
Thank
time.
you. Thank you all for being here.
You take care.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Right. Let's see.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay. And thank
Annie,
you.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderful research. Wonderful research.
Thank you very much.
Well, you can see that when it gets personal like that, it gets to another level altogether.
Right.
So take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Let's see, just trying now to close out. And let's see how we go here.